right, welcome back from lunch. Coming up, we've got some incident response war stories, which is always heaps of fun. It's just some of my favourite parts of the conference when you get the dirty details. I don't know how many dirty details we'll get, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of fun lessons learned, and I think there'll be plenty of time for Q&A, which will be really good. So we have Jarrod and Alistair from Cythera. They're the principal and senior consultants. So I think they've done a lot of work with a lot of the people around here. So I just wanted to, ask a really big applause for what will be a really awesome talk. Thank you.
Clicker. Yeah, cool. Thanks everyone. Just to do a bit of an intro, my name's Jarrod Loidl. This is Al Longley, and we work for Cythera. And for anyone that hasn't heard about Cythera, we're a managed services security provider. We live and breathe incident response and cyber resilience. That's us in a nutshell. And just wanted to say, at the risk of sounding cheesy, it really is a privilege to be here presenting today. My very first cybersecurity conference ever was at the Royal Pines at AUSCERT back in 2004. I can see some nods from people who were there back in the day. So in the spirit of AUSCERT paying it forward, that's why we're doing this today. This is a meme-heavy talk. So a meme is like 10,000 words in one shot, right? So I hope you guys bring your A game. Just to summarise what we're going to be going over a bit today, we'll just do a bit of an intro, a bit more about us to give context to what we're talking about. We'll discuss the Australian cybersecurity landscape just very briefly, just to set the scene. Again, it also helps to explain why we're doing this. And we'll then run through a few incidents we've responded to, as well as some of the common themes we see out there in the wild. And we'll then talk about some of the less commonly discussed aspects around IR. And there'll be things like incident response retainers, as well as stress testing IR plans. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we get into incident response simulation exercises. There's been some good talks about that here already at AUSCERT, which has been great to see. And then at the end, we'll just summarise some of the lessons. So just a bit about me. I guess you could say I'm a security jack of all trades, master of none. I've been really blessed in the time I've been working to have my hand in just about everything you can imagine, from GRC, operations, architecture, pen testing. I've even been a CISO once upon a time. But lately my focus has been on helping to battle-harden businesses with an emphasis on IR and overall cyber resilience. Al?
My name is Alistair Longley, Senior Cybersecurity Consultant at Cythera. Try saying that 10 times fast. I'm an offensive security operations lead at the team. But I'm also no stranger to putting on the incident commander hat, as we'll talk about today, and is also diving into the haystack full of logs, going looking for needles. When I'm not working in cyber throughout the weeks, I'm spending my whole weekends on Hack the Box and playing CTFs, so true cyber nerd, live, breathe, sleep it.
Just to summarise what we do in a page, and that's all of Cythera. I think it's safe to say that we solve problems. Well, that's our take anyway. We're kind of biased on that part. Now, just to give a bit of an overview of the cybersecurity landscape, I won't bore you to death with the wall of text. You can go out and read this later. We'll make the slides available. But all of the stats that we're referring here are actually from the ACSC website. So just to give the Cliff Notes summary, basically there's some modicum of success we're seeing, particularly in some of the government circles with the uplift. However, despite some relatively minor uplifts, the state of cybersecurity for the rest of the country is actually worsening. The frequency of breaches are coming in more frequently. The cost of breaches themselves are going up. Increase in vulnerabilities are also being reported from previous years. So in other words, there's a lot we could be doing better in terms of cyber resilience. Over to you, Al.
Perfect. Well, let's talk about what we came here to talk about here. Like we promised in the name, we're here to share some of the real incidents that we've responded to, and along the way, some of the key lessons and learnings we can get out of it, so we can avoid the Oprah model of, you get a data breach, you get a data breach, we all get a data breach. For our first incident I'd like to discuss, we had received a phone call from an e-commerce provider. They'd seen some suspicious activity on their web server, and their major concern was whether or not their customers' financial or personal data had just gone out the door. Even though we discovered some multiple web shells and backdoors installed on the actual web server itself, The specific initial cause of the compromise to this day remains unknown. This was due to a number of reasons. So, although we instructed the web developers to leave the server alone, don't touch it, they went through and started deleting things and deleting key evidence, which made the ability to tell the story that much harder. Although the web server had 90 days of activity logs and user logging, the actual web server provider on the infrastructure only had 30 days. This meant a very minimal look-back window while we're actually trying to tell the story of what went on. This meant that on day 0 of the logs themselves, we were seeing malicious activity. That means if you're seeing malicious activity for the entirety of your logging period, could have been ongoing for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, there's little definitive evidence to prove specifically when the initial compromise began. Of course, coupled with no multi-factor authentication for administrators to get in, start changing things, exfiltrating data, and a whole slew of vulnerabilities. It was a WordPress website with 40 plugins, some were modified source code forks, introducing even further vulnerabilities into the actual web server. So by the time we actually ran the vulnerability report for the server, the result ended up looking a little bit like this picture here. So there is a bit to address in our first incident, but the first major headache we ran into was insufficient logging controls. So knowing the customer were subject to data breach notification laws, but unaware of how long the breach had been ongoing for and hacker activity had been taking place, their legal counsel's advice was you have to treat all of your customer data, both current, past, from the beginning of time, as having been exfiltrated. Not a great decision, not a great spot to be in, but without logs, you have no way of really knowing. You might think insufficient logging is just a common practice among some of the smaller companies and younger players. Microsoft themselves have actually learnt this lesson the hard way in terms of their own logging controls. You do need to be keeping more than 3 months of logs, even if it's up to 12 months or going into cold storage, just simply logging more than you think you'll need. Microsoft have since, after a breach of US federal emails and government emails falling into the hands of nation-state attackers, they have increased logs for all customers by default in Office 365 to 12 months of detailed, rich logging. Consider also the fact that in more than 82% of cases of attacks, threat actors will cover their traces. They'll delete the logs behind them after they've made their exfiltration or made themselves at home. You need to be getting your logs off the servers, forward them off to shared infrastructure such as a SIEM. This could be AWS CloudTrail, Azure Sentinel, your own in-house SIEM. All of these are really great solutions to obviously retain the logs for long enough, but get them in a position where they can't be modified maliciously or accidental. Using things like structured data, JSON key value pairs, really speeds up investigation, not just for operational concerns, but also when you're responding to an incident, the actual speed to understand what's going on does require both structured logs and, if you can, enrich your logs. We actually did a whole talk at ASA BridgeSec last year around log enrichment and things you can use to superpower your investigations, if you'd like more details on that. Our next lesson and takeaway from this particular incident is one of the ASD Essential 8 controls. I'm not going to do my Steve Ballmer impression, but backups, backups, backups. If you've discovered nastiness in your production servers that has been there for multiple months and you're only keeping a single month of backups, you have no option but to restore back to a point in time that will introduce the same attacker malware or vulnerabilities that were present at the time you were actually breached and compromised. Backups should be 13 months minimum, year onwards. That can also be in cold storage, but also we recommend it as the backup should follow the 3-2-1 rule. So 3-2-1 rule is 3 copies of your data across 2 different types of storage media. One of those copies should be offline. A physical tape backup is awesome. That allows them to be air gapped and immutable, so you can't overwrite them and delete them, even accidentally or maliciously. And make sure you actually test restoring from these backups. They're useless to you if you don't know that they can get you back running unless you actually test them and put them through their paces. While you're testing these backups, consider who can access them, who can write to them, who can read to them, because obviously they are themselves a source of sensitive data. Audit the access to these backups, and please don't store the passwords and accounts to create the backups in the backups themselves. You're asking for a bad day. So moving on to our next incident, I'd like to speak about your public-facing attack surface in the context of a ransomware attack we responded to through a cyber insurer. So the client in question having the bad day was a medical provider. For whatever reason, still remains unknown, they decided to forward Windows Remote Desktop Protocol to the world through their firewall, explicitly allowing this through a rule. Completely unrelated in parallel, one of their software vendors, which handles their medical data, upon install of their software, it creates a new local administrator with a hard-coded username and password. This is true if you set this up here, anywhere in the world. This account exists, same username and password, the whole world over, as we saw with our medical provider. We believe a credential stuffing attack occurred. So a known username password was just sprayed against the internet indiscriminately and got a hit on our particular client. They ended up in a paste bin list. It's about as open source intelligence as it gets. You can literally just Google an IP address and just get their username and password. They're in paste bin. It's all indexed. At some point, either through their own attacks or discovering this actual list, our good friends ELF-V, also known as Black Cat, the ransomware group, got access to this username, password, IP address, and made themselves at home inside the network. Within 12 hours of getting inside the network, they got domain administrator. This is keys to the kingdom. You have complete control over everything. And of course, they started exfiltrating all of the patient data from this medical provider. Within 16 hours, every single server and workstation within this medical provider, both office, front of house, operational, completely encrypted, ransomware, left only behind a ransom note requesting Bitcoin. So when we talk about the ways in which an attacker may interact with your organization, the common term is your attack surface. So up top here is an any firewall rule. Someone explicitly went out their way, an IT admin, to allow the connection to Windows Remote Desktop Protocol, TCP 3389. Any means anyone from anywhere in the world is allowed to connect to this service. To a malicious actor or a penetration tester like myself, this is the equivalent of rolling out a welcome mat and putting it in front of your network and then getting confused why people keep rocking up. Meanwhile, through the modern marvel that is a Google search, simply typing in an IP address will yield results of IP passwords and users commonly seen in access brokerage, obviously doing a Robin Hood and letting everyone access into all these networks. Notice how, although obfuscated but highlighted, it's the exact same username and password for each of these pairs across the different IP addresses. That's just another example of that vendor using the same password across everything. If exposing RDP to the world is the welcome mat, this is the equivalent of leaving the key on top of the welcome mat. So the question for you is, what does your public-facing attack surface look like? What do you look like to the world? This isn't just what vulnerabilities have you got or unpatched software, simply what's exposed, what can we interact with, what is being scanned by Shodan, simply what is being exposed across your on-premise and cloud networks. Some tools that can help with this are attack surface monitoring, a very common buzzword that we hear more and more, ASM. There's also cloud security posture management, CSPM. That's more specific to your Azures, AWS, and G clouds, where it can run audits against your VPCs and just see, well, what's exposed, what's open, what's connectable. But for everything else and weird and wonderful that you're not sure of that isn't covered by those tools, an external penetration test will uncover all the gremlins or just the weird and wonderful things that you didn't realize were exposed. Don't forget, your attack surface extends more than just your web servers and your applications themselves. What information about your organization is in the public domain? I know at some point we've gone through and put our names into Google just to see what shows up. Have you done the same thing for your company, your IP addresses, in interesting service accounts? It's an interesting exercise. So that's what's on the clear web. What's on the dark web? Is there a forum post right now on breach forums of someone saying, oh, I've got a backdoor access into blah company selling it for $2,000. I've got the domain admins and things like that. Are you being discussed? Are you being talked about? You can know these things, and this is commonly solved by services like brand protection. There's many providers of those, very useful for uncovering the unknowns. But also your own open source intelligence offerings and cyber threat intelligence. There are so many feeds out there nowadays. I believe AUSCERT have their own, ACSC have CTIS and MISP. All are awesome. They're great for kind of discovering the things that attackers know about you that you wish they wouldn't. So I'd like to move on to our third incident. This is under the topic of supply chains and trust. This was a major multinational client for which we run managed detection and response for, so we have a SOC that responds to their alerts. Pardon me. Seemingly out of nowhere, our SOC received a bunch of internal alerts on the actual endpoints themselves. So there's no pretext for this, there was no external brute forces or IDS detections on some external attack that led to internal. Simply normal day, then boom, executions on an endpoint. So questionable, sus. What we investigated with, pulling the threads and going through the logs, we found the source IP address that caused the detections and the malicious activity. We could trace it to one of the offshore subsidiaries of this organization. So just overseas, they had a smaller organization which was trusted by our main organization. This trust was in the form of an SD-WAN route, that is a network interconnect that here's your network, here's their network, there's just a pipe between them. Likewise, there was an Active Directory domain trust, that is my users trust your users, you're welcome to log in from yours to here. That meant that moving from the small organization to the larger one, they just landed straight on production services, straight into no VLANs, no nothing, just straight in. Obviously, our security operations center do what they do. They hit the big red button. They network quarantines the impacted assets and servers to stop any further connections. They disable the actual users we saw through the investigations, and just temporarily we killed that SD-WAN link. A bit of social distancing and a snap lockdown, if anyone remembers those. Time and a place for them. Just off the back of this one, I'd like to pile on for a 2 for the price of 1. An example from just late last week that elicited a whole of government response around trust, with Metasecure being the victim themselves. I would like to emphasize in their media statement, my emphasis in red, even early in the investigation, they're already pointing the fingers as a third-party supplier or some vendor that was abused to cause this attack. I don't have all the details, and I'm not in the business of victim blaming, but we have enough lived experience to point to this and say, this is avoidable. So something we don't see a lot of in risk frameworks and ASD Essential 8, how do you manage security controls against third parties and your suppliers? So I would like to ask the question is, how wide is your web of trust? Who are you trusting? Between your managed services providers, your software vendors, company subsidiaries, contractors, and temporary staff, who is it you're trusting with your data and your network and basically your organization? I'd like you to think about how it is that you're trusting them. This could be creating VPN accounts for direct computer access into your network. This could be via virtual desktops, allowing the equivalent of just letting them run code and an application inside your network. This could even be guest accounts in your Office 365 tenant, where you're allowing some third party in to access your data. These are all forms of trust. With the people and organizations you trust, are they legally required to notify you of cyber incidents that they're encountering? Even if it's a near miss, even if it's just an investigation, if they notice something suspicious in their network that could impact you, are they legally required to let you know? If not legally, why not contractually? These are perfectly valid questions to be asking of suppliers and organizations that you trust with your network and your data. Another takeaway lesson from this particular incident is an exercise in defense in depth. I know that can be a bit of an overused or ill-explained phrase, so I'd like to team it up with another one. the Cadbury cream model. Sometimes I'll finish a penetration test or incident response and walk away and will describe the network as a Cadbury cream egg. Cadbury cream eggs have a hardened outer shell, difficult to crack into, but once you're in, it's all a gooey caramel center right for the taking. Please remember, attacks are stopped in layers. There is no dichotomy where you go from completely safe and fine to completely gone and compromised in a single action. That's just not how attacks take place. So treat your network the same way. You can go forth and harden your public-facing external attack surface, but then don't just say, well, once you're in the network, all the file shares are open, all the password vaults is just stored right there. We forgot what our permissions look like. Anyone can access anything. So do consider the defense in depth approach to network segmentation, but even just how you handle your data. Where it comes to third parties and supply chains, you can use watch lists. That is, if you have higher risk users that are external to your organization, put them on a list, so if they're doing anything suspicious, it will actually bubble up to the top because they are a higher risk innately. Likewise, where you operate a SIEM, it comes built in typically with user and entity behavioral analysis, UBA. That means if Bob only ever logs in from Bob's PC in Melbourne every day of the week, and then Bob logs in from Lithuania, that should set off alarm bells, not just because it's a different country, but it's just an anomaly in typical events. So you want to be tracking the anomalous incidents, even if they're not specifically a brute force or an attack, it should raise alarm bells. If you are responding to an incident or you're just not sure while you investigate and need to buy yourself more time, what levers do you pull in responding to an incident? So you can disable the user accounts, revoke sessions, all that good stuff. You should be able to network quarantine an asset. You should be able to hit quarantine and know that that server or computer, no one can connect into it or out of it. I believe there's a classic NCIS video around just pull the plug. If it's stupid, it works, and it ain't stupid. If you are ready just to pull the plug on your network, anything, all is fair in love and war, I believe is the phrase. All right, my final lesson before I throw it back to Jarrod. Multi-factor authentication and conditional access. This applies to the majority of all incidents we've ever responded to and plays a part in the last three that I've mentioned. MFA and conditional access are, of course, ASD Essential 8 controls, so don't just take my word for it. What that means is, of course, using a second factor for login, even if your password just ends up on a pastebin list, even if it's easily guessable or on rocku.txt, having that second factor it takes you from 50% up to 99%. It's stupidly effective. Likewise with conditional access, that allows you to do things like geo IP blocking. That is, if you're an Australian organisation, your staff are only Australian, there's no reason someone should be able to be logging in from Lithuania or Russia to begin with. Sorry to single those nations out. There's no reason to allow it. So simply blocking that by conditional access, very, very quick win. Little things like if you are to register a device for MFA, you can limit that to Australia only. So there's no reason why, I'm traveling overseas, I'm in the country, let me just quickly pull up my burner phone and register an MFA, and this will be my second factor. You can limit that by GeoIP as well. And your suppliers and third parties, you can ask them what MFA and conditional access are they using against their staff and networks. And even things like phishing awareness, cyber awareness and phishing sims, are your suppliers actually taking care of themselves? All perfectly valid questions that will make you so much more secure. Straight back to Jarrod.
Thanks, mate. So why is this fellow sweating? Well, he's probably not quite sure about his IR capability, so we'll talk a bit about that. Ultimately, the question around incident response retainers comes down to your confidence in your internal response capability and how confident are you that your organisation has adequate tools and resources in order to combat a cyber incident. And the answer to that is not as straightforward as it may appear. For example, there might be times we have insufficient skills in-house. It could be that one of your key staff or your lead incident responder has just left the organisation. It could be that you don't have enough tooling at the moment, or you're in a transition phase, maybe experiencing some technical outages at a point in time. You could also have budgetary constraints as well. So, and that as head of security, might have to make some very hard choices. Another one as well we see quite a lot of is resources being overloaded, whether it's just responding to project work or hiring freezes, that sort of thing. And another one as well that comes up a lot is the question around MSPs. And that's not to say that MSPs have bad security, but a lot of the time when we talk to our clients that have an MSP involved, they often don't want to put their security to the test, so they actually find, taking the defense in-depth model, they feel a lot more confident with just having a retainer service or something in place, just to support them in case someone does need to break the glass on that. And also, another one that comes up as well is around environmental specific concerns. So, for example, there might be things in your environment that keep you awake at night. One of the ones we've seen recently as well, and we've covered this in an incident response simulation for a client, was an excessive number of privileged accounts in their AWS environment. And they were really concerned about that because that was also coupled with the fact they had gaps in their process around how they were doing user access reviews and exiting staff. So they didn't know how many of these accounts were actually available to people, and there was no MFA involved. So, in those sorts of situations where you've got those sorts of tricky situations, it would give you that extra layer of insurance. Now, in saying that though, there's a few things you need to consider. So the lesson here is you need to be able to conduct fire drills of your incident response plan, as well as your retainer activation. So one of the things we see fairly consistently is assumptions being fed into the incident response process. So rather than rely on assumptions, we recommend you actually test and see for yourself. One of the worst situations we've actually seen is where an organisation went to activate an IR response at 9 a.m. on a Friday, and it wasn't until 5 p.m. on the Monday we were able to get access. So, and that was largely built on assumptions, and it wasn't stress tested. So we definitely recommend going through that cycle. And lucky from that case, it was a false alarm. So we also then recommend conducting the fire drills, doing it periodically, whether it's every quarter or 6 months. Find a frequency that works for you. That actually covers off a few different angles. One is it keeps the activation drills fresh in mind in terms of improving your operating security. And it also then helps to collect the feedback of that process if you want to whittle that response time down so you're getting activated faster. Because one of the number one takeaways we want to share with you guys is that speed is really essential to your success in IR. Also as well, you want to be conducting post-incident reviews along with every incident. And that's not just the major incidents, even your false positives. So with your false positives as well, it's often worth just asking the question, how did it progress that far before it was identified as a false positive? And even with the minor incidents as well, you might have nuisance alerts that are often going off and they're generating a significant amount of pain for you guys. And it's always worth then trying to tune those out as well. And integrate those learnings as part of continuous improvement. There's a big call out of that in the NIST CSF 2.0 framework, for anyone that's not familiar with it. So it's well baked into the framework. And also as well, we want you to just understand that your incident response retainer is a compensating control. It's not a silver bullet. So you want to be putting that in place as a temporary measure while you're addressing the points raised on the previous slide. So ultimately, don't assume, plan, test, learn, repeat. Now, next we're going to talk a bit about incident response simulation exercises. It's actually been quite refreshing at this conference to see a number of discussions around that, and even some of the conversations I've had with people about simulations already, that there's a rationalisation around the standards and approach, which is nice to see. Now, these go by a lot of different names, different people. ACSC refer to these as exercise in a box. And there's also people who have talked about cyber ranges as well for more technical formats. But for purposes of this talk, we're going to be focusing on tabletop exercises. So in this one here, we're going to be talking about two different types of incident response simulations we've conducted. So one was a top-down driven approach for the executives, and the other one was a bottom-up approach for service desk staff as well as the technical team. Now, in the bottom-ups, both the scenarios, they had an incident response plan, and we can confirm that the plan had been socialised in advance. And that's a common enough failing. We always ask that question before we even go into this process. But we were assured they had their plans, they'd been socialised. And so we ran through the drills in both clients, and these are completely different contexts we were doing these, and completely different client environments. In both cases, they failed to actually execute their IR plan, or at least until much later than would have been desired. So the question is why? What was the commonality here? And interestingly enough, with the service desk scenario, what they did, we found out after the fact that the communication of their IR plan, it was basically them pasting it up on the intranet. They didn't send out any emails or anything like that. So unfortunately, in that incident's end, they didn't know which incident response plan as well they were meant to follow, because it turned out they also had two incident response plans. One was for an ITIL type incident, and the other one was for a cyber incident, and both the plans had been written in isolation. In the executive top-down one, the plan had been sent around, but due to the multitude of factors, mostly around timing, there wasn't enough time to sufficiently brief the executives. They'd been emailed the plan, but there hadn't really been any sort of group training session or facilitation around it. So in that one, they didn't really follow the plan, but the interesting thing is that the executives themselves had enough familiarity with incidents and enough of the relationships formed, they were able to communicate with the other stakeholders, and eventually they found someone who knew the actual process, and then they actually kick-started off the plan. So ultimately here, the lesson is around communication, and communication is going to be the key to your success in dealing with incident response. So we're going to focus on two different types of communication here, but there's a third I'll get to in the next slide. First of all, with internal communications, posting your incident response plan on the intranet alone does not constitute communication of your IR plan. So one of the things we want to talk to there is you can't really over-communicate. So one is you want to be putting it out there in the intranet, making it accessible to the key players. You want to also make sure you're doing a group training session for those people. The other thing I want to call out as well is do one-on-one training with the named people in your IR plan. One of the things I've seen fairly consistently in doing this, especially for executives, they don't want to lose face in a room full of other executives. So if you're going to then talk to them about their IR plan and they're not clear on their role or they've got questions, they're unlikely to put their hand up and say that in a group setting. And you'll see this in other groups too, even just the more technical staff. So you want to make sure people are comfortable with asking questions. So we definitely recommend the one-on-one factor there. Also with your reporting, you want to start thinking about how incidents are going to come into your organisation. And the service desk is generally going to be one of the first points of contact. Anyone that's worked in a call centre or technical support, can I get a show of hands? Anyone that's actually worked in tech support? Yeah, right, yeah. Right, pretty much nearly all of us. All right, cool. So anyone that's done that, you know that you guys are going to find out half of the incidents that are happening in the organisation before anyone else, right? So when that comes into the service desk, you want them to have really good informal relationships with the security team as well as formal channels for reporting. So if they're not sure if it's a security incident, they want to be comfortable enough picking up a phone, calling up the security team and going, hey, I've just seen this. I'm not sure if this is an incident. Can you guys take a look at it for me, please? And also you need a mechanism then for triggering off your major events. So notifying your executive team and engaging at that level, particularly for things like a major ransomware attack or something of that nature. And you also need to consider your legal counsel. If you don't have legal counsel internally, then who do you go to externally for that support? And how comfortable are you that they can actually handle a cyber-related incident? From an external communications perspective, we want to really stress the nature of having a prepared crisis communication strategy and prepared statements. You can make them fairly generic, so you can then adjust them as needed for the specific nature of whatever incident you have to communicate out. But one of the things we see quite commonly in doing these sorts of exercises is people waste a lot of time just debating what they're actually going to say to the media. And particularly, whether it's in a simulation exercise or it's a live incident, it's always going to be far, far worse for an organisation to respond once the media are out in front with a message, because then you're trying to do damage control and you're now on the reactive. So you're far better off being proactive and leading the response. As well, you may want to consider then how you handle emergency overflows. So one of the things that we've seen as well is internally for a lot of the clients we deal with, their internal capacity to deal with the consequences of an incident, even just internally, plus a number of clients or even just public backlash potentially, can easily overwhelm their existing communication channels. So it might be worthwhile having a think about setting up a 1300 number or 1800 number prepared to a call centre. You can then give them the scripts you want your staff to then discuss or what information you want to share. You can even start thinking about things like who you want to have notified and in what order as well. And this gets really important because there is actually a sequence of events that does need to be considered. So for example, your cyber insurers generally want to be front and center of that, so you would have to notify them. Also as well, we've had a number of clients that have a large number of third-party relationships and contractual clauses that require them to notify their third parties. And if they don't have a prepared list of those, that can actually be quite demanding to try and generate that and actually meet any sort of SLAs they've got in contract that they have to report. We also then want to make sure that you communicate to your clients as well. So you have to think about all of these different parts of the chain. And also you need to think about any other vendors as well, or key suppliers. You might need to bring them into an incident, or you might need to notify them. So Al raised, I mentioned before about the need for your third parties to be able to notify you in the event of they've been breached. The door swings both ways on that. And lucky last, we're talking about communications. One of the things I do want to raise, and I'm glad a few people have actually brought up at this conference as well, is the need for an out-of-band channel for communications. So I don't know if anyone's seen Rambo here, but this is Colonel Troutman, and he's calling Rambo over the radio, and he's surrounded by cops. They're all eavesdropping, and they're about to try and get a fix on Rambo's position. So in a data breach, it's not uncommon to have a very similar sort of scenario where there might be two people trusted to each other communicating, but you don't know who else is listening. So when you're starting to talk about incident response, if you're going to have an out-of-band communication channel, how are you going to communicate that out? Because you have to think about it. If you put it into an incident response plan, and that goes up on your intranet, and then someone compromises your SharePoint instance or M365, there's a high potential for them to be able to read that document and then know your whole strategy inside out. So there has to be some consideration then how you want to pre-establish those channels and how you want to communicate that. So what we would suggest is it's perfectly fine to suggest that there is an out-of-band communication channel, but we would strongly advise against actually documenting what that is within that document. And it would be something you would then convey in those one-on-one sessions or those group sessions when you're talking to the named people in your incident response plan. Just to summarise here, I'll hand back to Al just to round us off.
Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground today, so let's quickly recap some of the lessons that we've actually gone over. Once we get to the end of this slide, I'm going to pause for a sec if you'd like to take a quick photo, because obviously it's quite a bit to take in. Let's go through it one by one. Logging. Logging's your best friend. Log everything. Store it for longer than you think you need. Log more than you think you need. Store it for longer than you need, because spoiler alert, you will need it. Backups and recovery. Remember the 3-2-1 rule. 3 copies of your data across 2 types of storage media. At least one of those should be offline. Understand what you look like to the public internet. If you don't know, now's a great time to figure out. Understand your web of trust. Who are you trusting explicitly, implicitly, or accidentally? Defense in depth, or the Cadbury cream egg model. Consider that the attacks are stopped in layers. Don't let yourself just be one and done at the first layer falling down. Multi-factor and conditional access absolutely will save you. Run it everywhere, not just your admins and your third parties. Every staff member should have these strict controls applied to them. Run drills on your incident response plan and the activation of, if you've got an IR retainer, you run fire evacuation drills for your office. The same thing can apply to your cyber response. As with any evacuation or emergency, communication is key. It will help you weather the storm, just the ability to get on the same page and communicate. But that extends to consider if your standard communication channels are completely taken out, compromised, got Rambo's cops listening in to try and intercept the communications. Go out of band if you need to, and have a plan for that and be ready to do that if you need to. And luckily last.
One last thing, share your lessons, everyone. So the only way we improve as an industry is to actually share all these lessons. And so we're giving a bit of the way some of our secret sauce and the things we've seen here as well. But in the spirit of the conference paying it forward, it's important we share all this as well. So we hope everyone here has managed to take something away from this talk at least. And if you guys walk out of here with at least one new lesson you can then implement into your IR plan today, then we've succeeded. So anyway, that's it from us. Is there any questions, anyone?
Thank you. While we're here, just because there were some gems of information, do we want to go back to that slide?
Yeah.
Click up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
So this is a comment, but I am going to bring it into a question. So it was about talking when you were mentioning out of band, and we've gone through out of band communications myself, but we've only ever done it within our security team, and we haven't specifically gone out of our way to establish out of band between the service desk or help desk and the security team. And I guess, do you have any like advice on how to best achieve that?
So traditionally the context we're talking about is around incident response, and it's around particularly for the named people within the emergency response team, or your cyber incident response team, and how they would communicate in an incident. So the example I want to use is if say Teams is compromised and that's what you normally use for your office communication, then at least they can use like a Signal or WhatsApp or whatever it is. You have to define what that is in advance, but then you use that and everyone knows then to fall back to that channel. And as far as then building out other teams and how you would then focus on restoring communications, that's a good question. You'd have to then sort of think more broadly how you would start from that incident response team and then circle out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just to pile on that, if an incident's occurring, you're probably in an incident war room. You're probably physically in the same room as well, which absolutely helps. As much as we love technology, there's a time and a place to ditch it.
This is a good one. How do you handle capturing and storing forensic data, particularly when it comes to the cloud?
Before the incident is the best answer to that one. So in terms of obviously logging everything when you don't need it and having it sit there for a rainy day. So that's the great first step, but prevention is the best cure. In terms of cloud, it's entirely dependent on your actual cloud provider. AWS and Azure have completely different controls. I can sit here and tell you that Azure has audit logs for all users. They keep it for 90 days. You can only view 30 days. It's a bit ridiculous without a PowerShell script. Pretty bespoke to your actual cloud provider. You can just jump on Google, type in GitHub. There's a few good scripts out there. Don't get compromised in the process though by some random script kiddie. But it really depends. If you're just running virtual machines, standard things apply. Linux Audit D and Windows event logs, awesome to a seam. But in terms of actual user logins and things, it's highly dependent on your platform. If you're asking that question now, it's probably good to do some research now.
I also really like this one. As someone who had previously only really dealt with that incident response retainer when something went wrong, what's the best thing a customer can do to make your job easier?
So that's a good question. Very broad and a bit to unpack. So I guess one of the things I would say is in terms of the onboarding, there's usually some sort of process you want to establish then for how you get access to their systems when they break the glass. And that's a discussion. What I generally recommend is lean on the service provider's recommendations as much as possible. It is a bit of a negotiation sometimes because different clients have different risk appetites. But just what I would then say is just keep in mind, ultimately in terms of principles, speed is what you're really after.
Cool. That's all the questions we had. So can I please get another massive round of applause for Jarrod and Al?